don't know her, and that won't be many of you, Eleanor's a writer and researcher who specialises in recovering women's lives and histories. She's written acclaimed books, notably Wilde's Women, which is subtitled How Oscar Wilde Was Shaped by the Women He Knew, and also The Lives and Loves of E. Nesbit. Eleanor's a rigorous researcher. She's always fair to her subjects, telling us the facts while being kind and forgiving of their faults. That's the kind of biographer that we would all like to have. She's got a knack of finding the interesting and memorable details and stories which bring her subjects to life. In Dublin, on a visit, Eleanor pointed out to me a postbox in a street, an ordinary Irish green postbox, quite old. But it happened to be the postbox where young Constance Lloyd posted her excitable letter to her brother Otho, writing that she was engaged to Oscar Wilde and perfectly and insanely happy. And that really, really brought the story to life. Eleanor's been a television researcher, a tour guide, a lecturer, and an editor. The Society first met her when she gave us a lecture about Ellen Terry in Ellen Terry's house in Kent. Eleanor came over from Ireland and met up with us for the first time on a minibus from London to rural Kent, which really does show quite a lot of bravery on her part. It's such a good job that she liked us. So, since then, she's become one of our patrons. She's a staunch friend of the Society, and we very much look forward to hearing more about her work on the Woman's World book. So, ladies and gentlemen, Eleanor Fitzsimons.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that lovely and very generous introduction. And that bus trip was an absolute joy and a lovely introduction to the Society and to everything you do. It's lovely to be here amongst friends, and I'm going to talk about a book that I never call my book because it's our book. I see it as the Oscar Wilde Society's book, and a magnificent book it is, and I'm very, very proud to have been involved with it. In 2023, the Oscar Wilde Society, of which I am thrilled to be honorary patron, approached me with the idea for this book and commissioned me to complete it, selected articles from the Woman's World. But this is a project that is only made possible through the wonderful generosity of Mrs. Jim Mitchell, who is here with us this evening. And only for her. Many of you will remember a similar occasion to this a couple of years ago when we were here to launch the wonderful edition of Constance Wilde's autograph book by Dr. Devon Cox, who is also here with us this evening, also made possible by Joan Mitchell, who has just been so staunch in her support, and we're very grateful to her. My project, which has benefited not just from my work, but from the absolutely tireless work and expertise of many society members, continues an ongoing process of retrieving the voices that are lesser known. The lesser known writings of Wilde himself, but also of his circle, and particularly of the women in his circle, and also of the lesser known women in his circle. All of those deserving of thanks in the production of this book are listed in the acknowledgements, and I'm actually frightened to try and list them here tonight because there really are so many. Vanessa among them, John helped us so much with the illustrations at first. But towering above them all, I have to say, is Robert Whelan, who's sitting down there in the corner of the room. I mean, the book, I think, is absolutely beautiful as an artifact, as an object. And Robert is entirely responsible for that and worked tirelessly to make sure that it was of the absolute highest quality possible, and probably beyond the highest quality that we thought possible. Robert had a vision for this book from day one, and he stuck with it, and he never ever compromised. And that's why it's such a beautiful item here today, and I'm so glad to have my name on it. I'm very aware that my name alone shouldn't be on it. While digitised copies of The Woman's World are available online, the real beauty of this book and the real beauty of this project, and what made me most enthusiastic about it, in fact, is that it allowed me the space and the time to provide a really comprehensive introduction to the magazine and to Wilde's time and Oscar Wilde's time there as editor. A lot of research has been done recently, and really, as usual, as mostly is the case with authors, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. So many people, particularly recent researchers, have done so much more to explore this period in Wilde's literary life and to demonstrate that it was so much more important and significant than was thought before. It also gave me an opportunity to add contextualising notes for a modern readership, so that the articles really, I think, can be brought alive, and we can understand a lot of the references that would be perhaps understandable to the readership at the time, but not so much today. But most importantly of all, I think from my point of view, is that I was able to introduce the contributors of these articles. These magnificent, mostly women and some men, who worked so tirelessly to promote their causes and who wrote so beautifully and so passionately, and who still, I think, have something to say to us today. A lot of these articles really stand up to the test of time and are just as valuable to read today as they were back then, and maybe even as better and more receptive audience for them in some ways, because they would have been minority voices, and it would have been very tough to write some of those very hard-hitting articles, just looking for rights, looking for a seat at the table, looking to be allowed to belong. The book is also very important because we've reproduced the images from the original magazines, the distinctive artwork that show the aesthetic influences in the magazine. And some of the artists that worked on the magazine are household names, Charles Ricketts and Roger Crane, but they were working on this magazine with Wilde far long before, months before, sometimes years before, they were actually working with him on his most famous books. And the origins of their relationship and their collaborations begin in the articles in the Woman's World. And I think that's a very important aspect as well, and an overlooked aspect to date. Now, recent scholarship reveals that the early biographers of Wilde have really underplayed the importance of his time as editor of the Woman's World. It was far more significant than was believed previously, and many early biographers, Richard Allen among them, relied too heavily on accounts left in particular by Arthur Fish, who was Wilde's sub-editor at the magazine. But very revealing research that has been done by Rob Marland and by Wolfgang Meyer-Sigerset has revealed that Fish was only appointed, in fact, in the latter part of Wilde's tenure as editor at the magazine, and he had very little knowledge of what went before, and he also only had contact with Oscar really in the office, which was a small proportion of the time that Wilde spent working on this magazine. So it's very important, I think, to be aware of that and to look at the months prior to Fish's involvement and the highly productive months that they were, and the amount of work, often quite tedious work, of attracting contributors, persuading them to write, suggesting, very often quite forcibly suggesting what they might like to write about, supporting them in their writing, and emphasising and supporting what they had written in the editorial note, in the notes on books and other matters that Wilde wrote, his only contribution to the magazine. So we get a very different picture when we take all of that information into account. Oscar Wilde, from April 1887, months before the first issue of the magazine ever appeared in November 87, took on the radical reform of a magazine that had been known as the Ladies' World, a magazine that he himself considered to be too feminine and not sufficiently womanly. And there was quite a shift in understanding at that time of what a woman wanted and needed and was interested in, and a lot of the magazines were trying to reflect this. But this magazine went further than any of its competitors in the marketplace. He transformed it into the recognised organ for the expression of women's opinions on all subjects of literature, art and modern life. It was the only salaried position that he ever accepted, and I believe that his disenchantment was driven largely by the opposition he encountered and by the lack of support that he got from his overlords at Cassell's, from the senior editors and the managerial staff there, who really put many barricades in his way and prevented him from doing a lot of what he would have wanted to do. Wilde recruited a brilliant group of women and the occasional man to write for him. And as the focus of my research has always been the women, and as Oscar, I think, is getting a lot of attention this week, the week of his 170th birthday, I'm actually going to spend a little bit of time telling you about some of the forgotten women, the lesser known women, who wrote for the magazine. And I'm going to take three in particular, three who have really resonated with me, in fact, and their stories have stayed with me. And the first of these is a woman called Dr. Mary Marshall. And she wrote a really positive, uplifting article called Medicine as a Profession for Women. And the gist of her article was, "This is wonderful. We have reached a time where medicine is a legitimate career for a woman. You can become a doctor, and here are lots of examples of women doctors working all over England and all over the world. Really positive. But what she didn't put into her article was her own she put the experience that women had had qualified as doctors, but not her own difficulties that she had encountered when she was trying to qualify as a doctor just a few short years previously. In 1869, Mary Marshall made history as one of the Edinburgh Seven. I don't know if anybody is aware of that group. They were a group of 7 women students accepted into the newly established medical school for women at the University of Edinburgh. And they were the first ever group of matriculated undergraduate female students at any British university, these 7 young women. They were segregated from their male counterparts. They were required to pay higher fees on the grounds that they were sitting in smaller classes, not through their own choice, but because they were segregated from the men. But things got worse for them. On the 18th of November 1870, they were accosted by a mob while they were walking to Surgeons' Hall to a lecture. An incident that did actually reach public attention and garnered them quite a bit of support. And among their staunchest supporters was Charles Darwin, to his credit. Now, Marshall was 24 years of age and married while she was studying, but she was very suddenly widowed. Her husband died and left her pregnant. She had a baby son, but he lived only for a number of days. But despite all of this difficulty she encountered, she still passed her exams with distinction. But that's when real tragedy struck. The university went to the Court of Sessions, pressurised by public opinion, and asked that they be allowed the right not to grant these women their degrees. And the court upheld that and ruled that these women were not eligible to receive their degrees and that they should never have been allowed to enter the university in the first place. But rather than be daunted by this, these incredible women decided to go abroad and to pursue their studies elsewhere, and Marshall was among that group. She entered the École de Médecine in the University of Paris, where she was required to repeat most of her clinical work and retake all of the courses that she had already completed. Difficult enough, but when you bear in mind that she was doing this through French. She did it. She completed the course and she qualified as a doctor, but she couldn't practice in her native England. She could only practice abroad. But she was lucky. Within a short period of time, the King's and Queen's College of Physicians in Ireland, I'm proud to say, became the first licensing body to permit women with foreign medical degrees to take its exams and to be licensed to practice medicine in England. And Marshall availed of this opportunity. She was appointed senior physician at the new hospital for women in Marylebone, but she had fallen in love with France by then, and she spoke the language fluently, so she moved back after 5 years, and she moved to Caen, where she practiced very successfully as a doctor for her career, and won the affection and respect of all of her patients. She was very well regarded. She returned to England in 1910. She was very ill at the time, and she died of pneumonia within a few weeks. And finally, she was given some credit for her life's work because the British Medical Journal said in a long and very warm obituary that she was immensely kind to everyone who came into her circle and to her patients above all. She also was rich in common sense, good judgment and good taste. In her dealings with her fellow practitioners in London and at Caen, she was absolutely loyal, just and considerate. So what a magnificent woman. She writes an article for Oscar Wilde magazine, Medicine as a Profession for Women, and I'd like to read you a short extract from that, where she's describing how women fared under this regime, but she doesn't ever mention that she was one of them. She says, "For although the women were taught in a separate class and at a different hour from the men, the examination papers of the two classes were identical and answered under precisely similar conditions. Out of this success arose the first friction between the women and the university authorities. One of the women was first student in her year in chemistry, in a class of 226 men, and as such she was entitled to a scholarship. The professor withheld it from her on the grounds that having studied at a different hour, she was not a member of the chemistry class. On an appeal to the Senatus, it was decided that the women were to have the ordinary certificates as members of the chemistry class given to them, whilst the successful student was refused her well-earned scholarship on the ground that she was not a member of that class. From this time, everything became increasingly difficult for the women students, as a course of active opposition to them was pursued by the medical party in the university. Through the medical vote, they had been forbidden admission to the ordinary lectures, and now these same professors refused to hold separate classes for them or to authorise anyone else to do the same in their place. This deadlock was got over by the teachers of the extramural school admitting the women to their lectures in the required subjects. On this, the ruffianly element among the male students broke loose. They mobbed the women at the entrance to Surgeons' Hall where the lectures had been given, pelting them with mud and assailing them in the streets with foul language. Not easy. So she is somebody who really struck me as a remarkably brave and tenacious woman, and a woman who probably would know nothing about it all had her article not been published in this wonderful magazine and lived on down through the ages with her experience. I think it's one of the best examples of the hardships and difficulties faced by women who wanted to become doctors at that time. And her article is an incredibly learned document that documents the progress of women all over the world, particularly in India, where a lot of English women worked as doctors, and in England and France and all over, and it's well worth reading. The second woman that I'd like to draw attention to is a woman that has received some attention recently because she's been championed by historian Mary Beard and recognised for her importance. Classical scholar and linguist Jane Ellen Harrison is regarded as the founder of modern studies in ancient Greek religion and mythology. And Mary Beard acknowledges her as, to quote, the first woman in England to become an academic in the fully professional sense, an ambitious, full-time, salaried university researcher and lecturer. By 17, she was proficient in Latin, ancient Greek and German. She studied classics at Newnham College in Cambridge as one of the first women students, but she was also absolutely passionate and devoted to aestheticism. She wore pre-Raphaelite dresses, she decorated her college rooms with William Morris wallpaper, and she favoured paintings by Rossetti and enjoyed the poetry of Swinburne, so she was a true aesthete. Harrison studied Greek art and archaeology with Sir Charles Newton, tutor of Greek and Roman antiquities at the British Museum, as many people did. He was a man whose lectures were very, very popular, and Oscar attended them, in fact, with Lily Langtry in tow. But she herself became a lecturer. She was a charismatic and unconventional scholar, and she developed a particular expertise in Greek vase painting. In her research on Athenian ritual and religion, she drew heavily on the iconography of Greek vases, at the very same time as Aubrey Beardsley and Walter Crane were also finding inspiration in the artistry of the Attic vase painters. And one of her students, a woman called Jessie Stewart, a friend, a student and a biographer of hers, put it that the aesthetic movement made appreciation of Greek vase painting possible. So she was combining the two worlds, the classic world and this new aesthetic appreciation, very much in the way that Oscar was himself. Newspapers noted that she lectured very attractively and was also passionately fond of skating and bicycling. And she gave the most extravagant lectures in the British Museum, including sound effects and gas-powered lantern slides, and they were hugely popular, particularly popular with women. And when she goes to write her memoir years later, she describes these lionesses, as she calls them, who came and sat and listened to her lectures, and she describes them as spinsters, well-born, well-bred, well-educated and well-off. So this was her audience, and she was delighted to have them. Now, Wilde was very keen to have Harrison write for the magazine because he includes her name on the list of potential contributors that he sent to Thomas Wemyss Reid back in April 1887 when he had been first approached to edit the magazine. So he appreciated how valuable her contribution would be. By then she'd actually written several aesthetic books, and she echoed Ruskin's view of art. The vision of the improving power of art was very central to her message as well. She wrote an article titled The Pictures of Sappho for the Woman's World, and it's a very learned, highly engaging and beautifully illustrated article. And afterwards, she continued to garner accolades throughout her life. In 1908, she became a lecturer at Newnham College, but she also became a central figure in the Cambridge Ritualists, prominent classic scholars who were interested in ritual. And she would have been a rare woman amongst men there as well. And just to read a little bit from her article, and she did something that's actually seen in a number of articles in the magazine, where she combined the ancient and the modern world, and really what that did was open up a whole range of possibilities for women, that there had always been prominent women, and that they could live lives as they wished to and as they chose to, and that this was a freedom that could be embraced then and now. So she writes about Lesbos, the island of Lesbos and Sappho, and the groups that she leads there, the women. And she says, these lesbian clubs and societies met, not for the discussion of domestic machinery, a thing permissible and even laudable, yet scarcely stimulating, but for the keen and emulous culture of the arts, The social instinct between women and women has been well nigh dead. How should they care to meet and talk when they had nothing or but two things to talk of? Two for the middle classes, economy and husbands, two for the upper, fashion and scandal. Interesting for 5 minutes, bearable for 10, wearisome exceedingly, saving the last scandal, that is, for 15. But the true social instinct among women is reviving, thanks largely to the impulse of collegiate life. It is possible now to ask a dozen women to meet without the melancholy conviction that one half will bore and the other will be bored. Women, we are told, are not clubbable, but who knows? They were in Sappho's day. One thing is certain, a woman who does not know the joy of meeting a chosen few, her college friends, her own elect, at a well-appointed feast, Sappho herself loved delicate things, has a fine sensation yet to try. And the last woman that I'm going to bring to your attention is an Irish woman, another absolutely formidable woman and a pioneer in her chosen career because she was a journalist, one of the few and early women journalists. She was born in Ireland, most likely Dublin, and her father died when she was very young, 16 years of age, leaving it to her mother to bring her up and to provide for the family. So her mother took her to Paris, where her career as a journalist began. It began by absolute chance because she wrote a letter back home to a friend, and her letter was so engaging and colourful and told such a vivid tale of life in Paris that her friend said, "Why don't you send something into the newspaper? I'm sure everybody would love to read this." And she duly did. And during her long and very successful career, she contributed to or was a correspondent for the Chicago Daily News, the New York Tribune, the New York Century, the London Morning Star, the Weekly Dispatch, the Fortnightly Review, the Contemporary Review, and many other publications. And she also wrote for the Pall Mall Gazette under various pseudonyms, and for 39 years she contributed a weekly column, Notes from Paris, to Truth, the magazine owned by her great friend, the infamous Henry Le Boucher, that's who you all know. She was described by her sister-in-law as a literary lady and wonderfully clever, making £400 a year with her pen, exclamation mark, because that really was something in that day and age to be making a living as a journalist as a woman. She married a fellow journalist, a man called George Morland Crawford, and he was the Paris correspondent for the Daily News. And between the two of them, they reported on the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871. And that actually gave her a huge advantage because she was granted admission to places that he just simply couldn't go because nobody suspected that she was reporting on everything. So she snuck into many meetings and sat there without even a notebook. She couldn't disclose what she was doing, so she had to sit there and memorize everything that was said. And some of the accounts of that time, the most vivid and accurate accounts, were left by this woman, Emily Crawford, who was able to gain access to these places by subterfuge and memorize what was said. So she demonstrated remarkable courage during that time as well. It was a very dangerous time. And she was paid tribute to. She was famous in her lifetime. And there was an article called A Queen Among Journalists, written by a columnist known as Flora. And this column gave readers some idea of how formidable Mrs. Crawford was. Mrs. Crawford knows not how to spell the word fear, wrote Flora. She is strong and courageous, both in heart and head. She is one of the single-minded, large-hearted and able-headed members of the journalistic profession. She is absolutely indifferent to the petty material side of life, which blinds so many to its great principles. Singularly devoid of vanity, widely acquainted with men and things, generous in judgment, she is kindness personified to the less fortunate. Endowed with great constitution, she faces her work with a soldierly spirit, fired with the conviction that there is nothing that a man can do that a woman cannot also do. So in 1890, Emily Crawford was made a lifelong Fellow of the Institute of Journalists. In 1901, she was elected President of the Society of Women Journalists. But when she was offered the Legion d'Honneur, she requested that it be given to her son instead. He was also a journalist. And she told a friend, "I refused it because such toys are better for men than for women." Such things. She was getting on with business. She died in Bristol in 1915, having been evacuated to England by this son, by her journalist son, because war had broken out by then. And she had been evacuated in 1914. And Gentlewoman described her as the greatest woman journalist of the age. But she's largely forgotten now. We hardly know that name at all, and yet she left such a valuable contribution behind her. And she wrote an article called Women Wearers of Men's Clothes. And in it she gives fantastic examples of wonderful women throughout the ages who achieved so much more by dressing in a manner appropriate to what they were actually trying to do in life. And just to give you an example of one of those women that she wrote about, she says, "In art, one must follow inner light and personal genius. A picture is a speculative investment. Those speculating don't care whether the painter, if a woman, wears petticoats or trousers. All they look to is the quality of her work. Rosa Bonheur had to go to fairs to make studies for her cattle and to wander afield unaccompanied, hence her choice of the French labourer's blue smock, cap and trousers. They protected by keeping her sex out of the sight and mind of the rough men with whom she fell in, saved her from being draggled, and relieved her of the wearisome task of trundling up skirts when she had to carry painting implements." Very sensible indeed. So that's just to give everybody a little taste of the calibre and quality of the women who were writing for this magazine. They were so interesting, and their articles are so valuable then and also today, I think. They leave a wonderful social history of the time, and they carried a campaigning message that still resonates to this day. And I think it's very important to remember that Oscar Wilde, who has taken a bit of a back seat in my talk, facilitated this. He stood back, he invited them to contribute, he published their articles, and he supported them in his editorials. And that is to be applauded and to be valued. Thank you.
Eleanor, that was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. What was it, a regiment of literary ladies that Oscar had gathered around him and persuaded to contribute, and you brought them to life, and with some wonderful, wonderful examples of their writing. It wasn't quite as easy as it may appear now, seeing the book there. As you say, it's a wonderful work of art, and Robert had enormous, but he really has created the whole thing. But he didn't start off quite as simply as that. We had a get together, those of us who were getting this started. And there were 2 points of view. One was what matters is the article, and what people would like is a book. You know, a book about this size, which you can carry and read in bed quite easily if you want to, and which would reproduce the essays with 1 or 2 illustrations, and it would be a modern book. The other point of view was the exact opposite, which is this is a Victorian magazine, and a tribute to a Victorian magazine ought to look like a Victorian magazine. And that, in the end, was the view that, well, quite quickly, was the view that prevailed. And I think we had great fun at the very beginning, getting it together. It isn't all that easy, as you might think, to just take something that's published and reprint it. It's not quite like that. You've got the thing there in a Victorian magazine, printed on rather fading, yellowing paper, and the print isn't, when you examine it closely, isn't really very sharp. And that produced terrible problems. We had to scan, or to optical recognition, every page of all the articles that were done and reset them in 11 point, I think it was 11 point in the end, 11 point time Roman, and that in itself is an enormous job. It also means that you read the articles for the first time. You're correcting misprints from optical character recognition. You are reading closely and attentively. And I must say that although all the articles there are wonderful and fascinating, interesting, and Eleanor makes them sound absolutely entertaining and up to date, which indeed they are, there are other articles as well, which brought to my mind when I was reading something. Oscar used to pay £1 a page, and he paid £1 a page whether they were illustrated or not. So if you had wrote an article that would occupy 3 pages, and you put in 2 pages of photographs, you got £5. And that was, you felt was an incentive. You also felt sometimes that there was padding, shall we say, or rather extended writing about detail, which once again you felt this is filling in another pound's worth of page. But these were just the minor incidental pleasures of doing the preliminary work. Once we got over the original idea, got to the point that it was going to be a facsimile, not a facsimile, a reproduction in the original size of the magazine. Everything fell into place, everything went fast, and you worked at it enormously hard. Robert worked at it enormously hard, and there is the result behind you. It is a distillation of the best of the articles in the Bond's world, and we're enormously grateful to you, Eleanor, for doing it and for telling us about it so in such a lively and entertaining fashion. Thank you so much. Thank you.